pleasure today to introduce Jamie Pennebaker, who's visiting us for it's the second time formally, but you've been brief.
Actually, third time. Well, the first time was 2 weeks.
Yeah, okay, it was brief, I guess, for extended, second extended period, which is great. It's great to have Jamie walking the hallways, making connections. Jamie is the Regent Centennial Professor of Psychology at UT Austin. He has done foundational work in social psychology, but also what you would say clinical, cognitive, health psychology, related topics that maybe go broader than social psychology. He did his early work in recognizing and working with people who had experienced trauma and how the effects of them expressing themselves in natural language, and this made him more intrigued with natural language, and it's linked to internal psychological processes, and that led to a whole set of interrelated topics, including work on tools like the loop, set of loop tools for mapping in a way that many psychologists could use language, terms and language to psychological states. And at Microsoft Research, he's done a number of things, working with Scott, myself, others, Shamsi, Paul, Adam, on a number of topics where we see a fresh intersection of social psychology with complementary topics in computational social science. We'll call it that for the broad area right now. So with that, let me just turn it over to Jamie. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So it's I've got to say, I just love coming back to Microsoft. It's for me, it's like being in a candy store. So I come here, I really don't do much, except I talk with people. So I've spoken with at least half of you, and then there's another group that I've spoken with as well. And so every time I come here, I learn so much. And the excitement for me is, I live in a very different world. I'm in a psychology department. In a psychology department, and in much of what I do, it's based on a field that's very traditional in the sense of the paradigms that have been used. Usually small samples, laboratory studies, and so forth. And what's so exciting about what's happening now in the computational world, in the digital world, is the ability to do real social psychology, really ways of understanding social processes, by having access to ridiculously large data sets, and the ability to do interesting experiments in ways that can give us a sense of how people think and work with others in ways that have never been done before. And one of the punchlines of my talk today really is, you guys are doing some of the best psychology in the world, and your colleagues who are in psychology departments don't know about it. And the people in psychology are doing some of the best work in psychology in the world, and you don't know about it. And one thing I really urge is to have more interactions with people like me, and maybe more talks, more papers in psychology journals, just to suck people into your web, and maybe they can suck you into their web as well. Now today I'd like to give kind of an overview of some of the work I've done, and I've spoken here before, and I'm sure you all have memorized every time I've been here and been reading all my materials. But on the off chance you haven't, I'm going to give kind of a brief summary at first. And this brief summary is just to talk about the nature of different types of words, focusing on a group of words called function words. And then talk a little bit about how they're related to personality, and raise some really fundamental questions about what personality is, what we mean by it, and how it's measured. And then moving to the use of function words to understand how people think, and linking that to psychological factors, tying that then to social processes. And then the last part today is really what the title here is all about, which is looking at the nature of narrative. So the idea is that function words tell us about about people's basic personality, how they see the world, how they see themselves. It's related to how we can understand interactions, but it's also how we can use this to understand text itself. Now, before I begin, I also want to acknowledge that this work is part of a huge project that's been going on for years with a remarkable group of graduate students that I've had. And Ryan Boyd, who's right here, is now a postdoc with me, and he's been very influential in much of the work that I've done for the last 5 years. All right. Phew. Okay, now I'm finished with the slides for a while. That was overwhelming with that. In fact, let's just turn it off. It's been funny. Sometimes I have given talks at conferences where there's multiple people and everybody else has slides and I don't. And then I'm watching the audience looking at the screen. Surely something's going to come up. Something's bound to come up any minute. All right. So the first issue is by way of background. Early in my career, I stumbled across a finding that was really interesting, and that was I discovered that people who had experienced major upheavals in their lives that they had kept secret were more likely to have health problems than people who had not kept them secret. In other words, it seemed as though talking about upsetting experiences to others provided some health benefit that keeping a secret didn't. And this made me wonder, what if we brought people in the laboratory and had them in some way write about or talk about an upsetting experience? And that's what I started to do. We'd bring people in the laboratory. By a flip of a coin, they would be asked to either write about a traumatic experience for 4 days, 15 minutes a day, or to write about superficial topics for the same amount of time. We got their permission, and we tracked their health visits. These were college students in the first studies. And we looked at how often they went to the student health center in the months before the experiment and compared it with the months afterwards. Now, most college students go to the doctor for upper respiratory infections. And what we found was in the 3 to 6 months after the experiment, those who wrote about traumatic experience went to the student health center at about half the rate as people in our controls, half the rate as people who weren't in our study. We did other studies. We did studies working with psychoimmunologists where we would draw blood from before the experiment to after to 6 weeks later, looking at various immune markers. And these early studies, which were published in the 80s, started to be replicated by others, and there now have been easily 1,000 expressive writing studies. And as you stand back, the effects are modest, but they are consistent. Writing about upsetting experiences has positive physical and mental health benefits. Why does it work? Well, the reality is it works for all sorts of reasons. One is it forces people to acknowledge this horrible thing happened. Secondly, it provides a way of labeling it, and also to make a story out of it, to make it more understandable. Now, early on, I was trying to figure out how to identify who benefited from writing versus those who didn't, because not everybody benefited. And so it occurred to me that the way to approach this was to actually look at what people wrote, because when people wrote about these traumatic experiences, they were deeply personal experiences. And we got judges, graduate students in clinical psychology to read these essays, to evaluate them on multiple dimensions. And the first thing I learned was that judges don't agree very well in terms of natures of writing. And secondly, reading all of these depressing stories depressed the students who were doing it. So it was not an effective method. So it occurred to me a computer program would be much more effective to do this. And this was in the early 90s, and I started looking for one, couldn't find one. So with one of my graduate students at the time, whose undergraduate degree had been in computer science, we wrote a computer program that became Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count LIWC, the LUC program. The LUC program is, from a computational perspective, is such a remarkably stupid program. It's almost embarrassing to talk to this group about it. But it works. And, and the idea behind it was, the logic of this was, it occurred to me that if a person uses groups of words in consistent ways, that could be thought of almost as as a personality. So if a person used positive emotion words when they're writing from emails or other kinds of texts, the first question, were they reliable in using positive emotion words? The answer was yes. And if a person uses one kind of positive emotion word, like happy, do they also use other words like joy and other words? And the answer was yes as well. In other words, we can now come up with a corpus or a dictionary of positive emotion words and negative emotion words, etc., which now is thought of as sentiment analysis. But we could get other kinds of words as well, cognitive words. So we have a broad cognitive category and subcategories, getting at causal thinking, words like because, cause, effect, reason, rationale, or words that we call insight words like realize, know, meaning, etc. Now, it should become very clear if you're a linguist, you're already having palpitations. Linguists often find what I'm doing, or they used to find it as appalling, because what it does is it completely ignores context. And as anybody knows with words often have lots of different meanings. So the word mad usually is associated with anger, but it's also I'm mad about him, meaning you're in love with the person, or the person's mad as a hatter, meaning they're crazy. But the point is it's all probabilistic. It doesn't matter. So you have enough words, and you're averaging, so you can see why linguists just go, oh my, yeah, you're going, oh my God, I'm in the wrong room. Exactly. And I should tell you, the very first time I gave a talk in a linguistics department, I just went in, girded for battle. And at first, there was just like, oh my God, I can't believe he's doing this. But then, as I was explaining the logic of it, even the linguist kind of came around thinking, well, maybe, okay, we'll let him go along. In any case, the idea is we came up with these multiple dimensions, and as long as we were doing these dimensions I've just told you about, you can throw in other things. So you could throw in pronouns and prepositions and articles and conjunctions, etc. And because it's easy, it's just as easy to throw in these other dimensions, and you could have different types of these dimensions. And to make a long story short, we eventually found that certain dimensions of language did in fact predict who would benefit from health. It was modest in terms of predicting things. And the things that became interesting were these cognitive words, that people who increased in their use of these cognitive words like causal words or insight words, benefited more than people who didn't use those words. Or so that if it was almost a marker of people constructing a story, that those were the people who benefited. We also found some odd kind of pronoun shifts, that people who bounced back and forth between first-person singular pronouns, I, me, and my, versus other kinds of pronouns, he, she, they, you, we, bouncing back and forth there using, basically it was a latent semantic analysis strategy, those were the people who benefited the most as well. In other words, people who changed in the way they were writing seemed to benefit. And I started looking at other data sets, and something kept bouncing out that I was expecting to find big differences, say, between men and women, between depressed and non-depressed, and other dimensions by looking at what people were writing about. But I kept finding these weird differences with articles and prepositions and so forth. And it was about this time I came across a book by George Miller called The Science of Words. It was published in '95, and it's one of those books that just changed my thinking, because he made this distinction between function words and content words. Content words are nouns, regular verbs, adjectives, most adverbs. They account for 99% of all the words we know. The average person has a vocabulary of 50 to 100,000 words. Almost all of them are these content words. But then there's this small group of words, junk words, function words. These function words are pronouns, prepositions, articles, conjunctions, auxiliary verbs, negations, maybe a couple of others. And in English, there really are only about 180 common ones. But here's what's interesting. Even though they account for less than 1% of our vocabulary, all of us in our writing, our speaking, whatever we hear, we read, they account for 60 to 65% of all the words. These are the words that are the most prevalent. And by the way, when you're learning them in a second language, they're always the hardest to master. And what's interesting about these words is that they don't have content in and of themselves. They change. So the word I means me when I'm using it. It means you when you're using it. And they're just a different class of words. And one of the things that Miller pointed out, and then I've since become interested in, is how these two types of words differ in terms of how they're processed in the brain. So most of us, whether you're right-handed or left-handed, most of our language is understood and generated through the left hemisphere. And what's interesting is two areas have been focused on a lot, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe has one region that, if damaged, results in some really striking differences, and that area is Wernicke's area. And in the frontal lobe, which is it's also right next to the temporal lobe, is Broca's area. And damage to these two areas result in very, very different kinds of damage. So, for example, damage to the temporal lobe and Wernicke's area, if you ask a person to describe what's on the podium here, here's what's interesting. They'd say, oh, sure. And by the way, they're often socially engaged. They look you in the eye. Oh yeah, sure. This is here, and next to that is that. Oh, you can see that, and it's over there. Their language is often referred to as a word salad, but the salad is made up of function words. They're really sparse in terms of content. Damage to the temporal lobe, on the other hand, or damage to the frontal lobe, to Broca's area, results in a completely different kind of deficit. And the first is the person is not socially skilled. They don't look you in the eye, and which is consistent with frontal lobe damage. And they also, when asked to describe this, they'll just name things. Oh, podium, black microphone, and it's a painful kind of discussion. Now, if you dig more deeply into what function words are, they are intimately social. They are words that require a social relationship and social skills to use and to understand. So, for example, if when you came in the room today and on the floor there was a note that says, "I'm not here, I'll be right back." On one level, that note makes sense. Another, it makes no sense. You can make a story of what it means. That note, because it's made up of all function words, really only has meaning for the speaker and the intended audience and nobody else. And if we could track down that person who wrote the note next year and say, hey, you wrote this sometime in the past, they might look at it and say, I have no idea what that even referred to. But what's interesting is those are social words, and to understand them requires social skills. Now, this is where function words start to become really interesting, because function words tell us where people are paying attention. They're telling us how they're thinking about their topic. They're telling us what their relationship is, not only with their audience, but also with the topic itself. And by going through and looking at language, we start to get a sense of who these people are. A good example of this, and this is an obvious, almost stupid example. I could go into everybody's email, and I'm sure Eric would give me permission, and analyze everybody's emails, but only look at third-person pronouns. He, she, they, words such as that. And I guarantee you there are huge variation. Some of you use those words at very high rates, and some of you use them at very low rates. And I can guarantee you that measure is a marker of how socially connected you are, how interested you are in other people. Because by definition, if you're using those words, you're thinking about other people. And some people are, other people just don't interest them very much. And that's okay, but it also means that they're not going to be using those words. So if we can almost use this as a marker of personality. We can do this for many other things as well. Another one is, one of the most diagnostic words is the word I, or just first person singular. So in everyday spoken language, the average person in this room uses I probably 6% of all the words you use. That's unbelievably high. Think of any content word that you use, and it's probably, I can guarantee it's less than 1%. So 6% is unbelievably high. Now what's interesting is that I words, I think when I started, most people who think about the word I assume it's associated with self-confidence, arrogance, leadership, things like that. No, I is a marker of self-focus. It's a marker of looking inward. And the people who use I more are people who are insecure, who are depressed, and we can track people over time. When they get depressed, they use I more. When they get out of their depression, they use I less. And it's a marker of this self-focus. We can have people write when they're sitting in front of a mirror, and they write I words at higher rates. Now, and we've done some studies on suicidal versus not suicidal poets. It turns out suicidal poets do not use sadness words at higher rates than non-suicidal poets. They do use I words at higher rates. And we've done some interesting studies tracking people who ultimately commit suicide. We've done some historical studies and to find out if this person was likely murdered or was it suicide. And what we find is if I words start increasing in the months toward the death, the probability of this being suicide is much higher. Now, this gets into a really interesting question about the nature of personality. Think about what personality is. All of us have an intuitive sense of personality, and if you are doing some research in personality, you go to the internet and you find one of two things, either Myers-Briggs or the Big Five. Now, here's an interesting problem. Self-reports are self-theories. They are beliefs about who you are. Now here's a big secret we don't like other people to know about. Self-reports do a pretty crappy job at predicting actual behaviors. And why is that? Because, and I should also say, actual behaviors and self-reports have really different psychometric qualities. Self-reports are lovely psychometrically. They're normally distributed, they're highly internally consistent. Our self-theories are really, they're beautiful. I am a person of high integrity. Then, do you cheat people? Well, no, I'm a person of high integrity. Do you do this? So you have all these self-reports, so they're consistent, but if we get objective measures, they're not strongly related. Some are a little more strongly related than others, but to think of self-reports as the end-all of personality is a grave, grave error. What about behaviors? Well, behaviors, unfortunately, they're not as consistent. They are messier. What about language? Oh dear, language is also tends to be somewhat messy as well. Well, one of the things that Ryan and I have argued recently is maybe we should start rethinking personality, not just go beyond self-reports. Thinking about language as personality. That is, language has all the characteristics of personality. It's reliable over time, it's internally consistent, and it tends to be related to behavior often at higher rates than self-reports. What this means is, if in your world you're trying to come up with a concept and you're thinking, well, we need a self-report, we need a group of judges to fill out questionnaires to validate if what we're measuring really measures it, you'll find that you may be smart to think about language as your outcome or as your marker as opposed just to self-reports or some kind of behavior. Now, a good example of this is one that we've been playing with for the last few years, and this is looking at thinking styles. How can we get at how people think? Several years ago, I was involved on a project looking at could we look at admissions essays of students and use that to predict how they do in college. And we were able to get admissions essays from 25,000 students who came to the University of Texas over 4 years. And I started playing with the data in some interesting ways. So in terms of these function words, there are really about 4 broad classes of them. Articles, prepositions, etc. So I first did essentially you could almost think of it as topic modeling of these dimensions. And to my surprise, one dimension emerged, one central dimension. And this dimension is articles and prepositions are positively correlated, about a 0.3. Then these other dimensions, pronouns, both personal and impersonal pronouns, conjunctions, negations, auxiliary verbs, non-referential adverbs, all of those are correlated with each other about 0.2, 0.3. And all of those are negatively correlated with articles and prepositions. It's almost as though we can think of this central dimension of language along a continuum. And the psychometrics of this are amazing. You can just add up, pronouns, auxiliary verbs, etc., and then subtract articles and prepositions, and it's statistically an internally reliable marker. Now, we actually do it the other way so that high numbers, articles and prepositions, the other one are negative. So along this dimension, you have people, and any given text can be put in terms of people who are very high on articles and prepositions and low on the pronouns and so forth, or those who are high on pronouns and auxiliary verbs and low on articles and prepositions. What's interesting is when you do this, you pull out the people who are high on this end. We call it analytic thinking. And their essay for coming to college will be, the University of Texas has always been a university that I feel as though would be good for my career. The 3 reasons I'd like to attend are such as it's organized, it's structured, it's hierarchical, it's formal. At the opposite end, ever since I was 5 years old, I wanted to come to the University of Texas and study psychology because when I was 5, my family moved from this town to that town. I'll never forget when we got in the car and they're telling a story, a really nice narrative. It's not formal, it's not logical. Now here's what's interesting. We can get this, we can get this what we call analytic thinking, analytic at this end, narrative on this end. And we can correlate it with 4-year grade point average, whether you're in fine arts or physics, engineering or psychology, philosophy, it makes no difference. Within any given major, any given gender, any given anything, the correlation is about a 0.2 between analytic thinking and 4-year grade point average. What this is telling us, positive, that's right, yeah. Well, it's interesting because every major, what university is training in analytic thinking. Analyze and deconstruct this particular problem. It doesn't matter what your area is, even if it's in fine arts, it's the same as any other field. It's also, this analytic measure is really reliable. Brian and I did a really cool project a few years ago looking at a lost manuscript, or I guess a found manuscript, presumed to be by Shakespeare. It was a play called Double Falsehood. And we used, what's interesting is you can get analytic thinking, and there were 3 suspects in the case. Was it the person who found the manuscript, a Shakespeare scholar who found it about 100 years after Shakespeare, or a contemporary, John Fletcher, who Shakespeare had worked with? And looking at their collected works, each of their plays, it was like a shotgun of scores. So for this guy Theobald, who discovered the manuscript, everything he wrote his analytic scores were like this. He was very high in analytic. I guess I should be over here. And then here was Shakespeare. All 31 of his plays are right here. And then this other guy, Fletcher, all of his were right here. There was virtually no overlap. There was some overlap between Fletcher and Shakespeare. It turns out they had written things together. And the missing play was very much looked like it was in Shakespeare's world. And we used other methods in terms of machine learning and looking at content and others, and they all converged on the same thing. But it was the first time for me showing just the power of this analytic thinking. Now, rather than get into this too deeply, let me just toss a couple of other aspects of this. So all of this is essentially showing that we can use, through these function words, get a sense of personality. And we can also get a sense of, another thing that we can look at is we can look at this to get a sense of people's social skills and social abilities. So for example, in analyzing language, one of the things we find is that we do a shockingly good job at identifying people who are high versus low in status. So a person who is high in status, a person who's high in leadership, tends to not use the word I. And people who are insecure and low in status tend to use the words I at a much higher rate. And not just I, but a whole series of words, but primarily pronouns. The person who is higher in status uses, in place of I, they tend to use we and you at relatively high rates. Individuals who are low in status tend to use I at fairly high rates. We also, and what's also interesting is when we look at actual interactions. We've done multiple studies looking at interactions between people. We do a good job at identifying who's the relative status. And in a conversation, status can sometimes flip. So the two people are talking about one thing where one person is an expert, and then they switch to another topic and the other person is the expert. We see corresponding flips in pronoun use as well. And then one of the dimensions that we've done a lot of work on over the last 4 or 5 years has been language style matching, looking at the degree to which two or more people are connecting with one another. In other words, are they using words in comparable kinds of ways? And what we essentially do is calculate the degree to which they are agreeing and they're using comparable rates of pronouns, prepositions, articles, etc. And by analyzing that, we get a sense of the degree to which two people are on the same page. And we can do this with groups as well. So entire groups, we can look and see how is this group on the same page. And we can track to identify when groups are starting to fall apart. And there have been some other really cool projects on this by Christian Dinescu and others, where they have used both language style matching to identify who looks like they're falling out of the group, as well as looking at the degree to which they match the group in terms of content words as well.
And for that work, Chief, which communications are we looking at in particular?
We've looked at this with our in-class groups, where we have small groups working with one another, and
What is the encoding email or some other?
These are people in small groups that we actually have.
Transcribe.
That's right. No, they're typing it, so it's.
I see.
So we have access to it.
As you're talking, I'm just to be honest about what my thoughts were with the whole group here. Back to your earlier, slightly, humorous remark. We have the ability to do, in some circumstances, eyes-off analyses of large amounts of corporate email.
That's right. And
it's really, these studies haven't been done before. We get a lot of questions about how our works, and we could possibly reach some hypotheses and test them with large-scale Microsoft data.
In fact, I'm part of a company. It's called Receptivity, and we're actually doing that with some large corporations now, trying to get a sense of who are the people who seem to be disengaging from the company. So they start talking less and less, and by doing that, could you send somebody in and get a sense of, tell me what's going on in your life?
I was thinking of that particular case, but we do have people who at some point in time announce they're going to company X, goodbye. And so you can imagine that's a big data, that's a data set.
Yeah.
But we have other things too. We have people that perform well. We have like annual performance scores of various kinds, and then email over the year. And it always just trends over time, who gets promoted, who doesn't. And but each thing, not even to talk about causality is a whole other story, but just look at some of the correlations.
Yeah. No, And I love this kind of stuff. And we've also done studies where we manipulate style matching. So we have these groups working together, and then so in the introductory psychology class, we tell people what language style matching is, what the numbers mean, and we say you all are going to be working together in these small groups, and we'll give you feedback every now and then. So they're working on a project, and every 2 or 3 minutes, they get some feedback saying, one thing is, it'll be, your group's style matching score is, 0.7. This suggests that you're not paying close attention to one another. And by the way, style matching is associated with how closely you're paying attention to other people. And what happens is, after we give them that kind of feedback, they start paying attention more and their style matching scores go up. Now here's the sad thing. They don't perform any better. We can change, but it doesn't necessarily make the group, do they learn more on a subsequent test. But these were pretty crude tests that we'd had. Now, all of this, and there have been many other language style matching projects, some really sexy ones, but sadly you're not going to hear about them unless at the end when we have questions you want to know more. Because there's another thing that I'm really most excited about, and that is everything I've been talking about has been looking at how we can use these text analyses to get a sense of the author, and sometimes the relationship between authors or between people through the analysis primarily of these function words. About, I guess 10 years ago, with our Luke computer program, I updated every several years. And that version, I always thought, wouldn't it be cool to have it so you could segment text so in X number of segments. So we got the new program working, and I teach a large introductory psychology class. Back then, it was only 500 people. Now I co-teach it, so it's 1,500. Finally, some decent sample sizes. So, but what I would do would be I would have students work on a task, such as looking at it was called a thematic apperception text, a TAT. It's a picture, and people look at it, and then they're supposed to write a story about it, and they have just a few minutes to write a story. So I had done it with the 500, and it was done as homework for them. It was done online. And so I had all the text, and I thought, I had to just run it through this segmentation program. So I broke them in that particular study, I think, into 7 equals boxes. And so that each one was Luke. So a person would tell a story, we slice it up into 7 equals parts, and then I just looked at the means, the averages of all of these parts. This has never happened to me before, but what happened was many of the dimensions, what I saw were beautiful lines. Now, again, you guys live in a big data world. You're used to beautiful lines. I lived in a small data world. I've never had a beautiful line in my life. But, for example, I'd find articles. Articles would be very high at the beginning, and then they'd drop. And then these other ones, and I'll show you some more in just a minute. Auxiliary verbs, they'd start low, and then they just go up. And then some of these cognitive words, they go up, and it'd be a nice, beautiful curve. And I thought, this is unbelievable. And 2 or 3 years later, we started to do a project with novels, and I found similar kinds of things. And then over the years, I tried to get student after student to get involved in this project. But it turns out a social psychologist, this is not their idea of fun, because it's really not why they got into the field. And then finally along came Ryan and and another student, Kate Blackburn, who have joined me on this project. And what we've been doing is looking at kind of the nature of narrative and trying to make sense of it. So I would like to show you that I really can do slides. And what this is based on is a series of dimensions, of which I've talked a little bit about, but I'm going to have to tell you a little bit more. So what we did is to to break out this analytic thinking in terms of the kind of the two dimensions. One is articles and prepositions, and we're going to call that dimension setting the stage, because at the beginning of a story, you have to set the stage. This is the definition of a narrative. Once upon a time, there was a fox, and the fox lived in a house on a hill next to, but there are all these articles and prepositions you have to have. And once you've established that, you don't need to set the stage anymore, except maybe when a new character comes in, but you've got to set the stage at the beginning. The second is this idea of plot progression. And this is the whole thing of pronouns, auxiliary verbs, negations, conjunctions, adverbs. Auxiliary verbs are is, am, has, have, had, etc. And the idea here is once you set everything up, then the action can start. The people start moving, they start interacting, and there's more stuff going on. And then the last issue, and this goes back to, frankly, Aristotle and a whole series of people who have been experts in narrative. There's always this idea that there is some kind of cognitive tension or the crux of the plot, etc. And it seems to occur usually in the middle or late middle of a book or whatever. And the idea here is it's the work of, it involves working through. Now this is actually really interesting because several years ago when we created Luke, we created a dimension that we had insight words, causal words, and other words like that. And to make this kind of a hierarchical program, we just threw all of them in and just called them cognitive process words. I never paid much attention to that overall category, and then some other people started publishing that they were finding really interesting things. And one of the most interesting was a project where people were looking at country and western songs. And they made a distinction between two types of songs. Songs that told a story, typically involving a truck and rain and prison, to quote David Allen Coe. Or they're songs that are just about feelings or emotions or, not a story. And they were curious, or what they found was huge differences between stories and non-stories in terms of cognitive words. I would have guessed, and I'm hoping you're guessing wrong, that stories have more cognitive words. No. Stories have far fewer cognitive words than these more impressionistic stories. Because what they discovered, and other people have studied since, cognitive words are used when you're working through something. You're trying to figure out what's happening. And in these stories, they know what's happened. So there was fewer of these cognitive words. But later studies we find when people are uncertain, when they're trying to figure something out, they use cognitive words more. Okay, so we now go into our first group of corpora. So we have 2,500 novels from the Gutenberg group, short stories that we downloaded, 2,100, and then these TATs. I have an online website that people all over the world can write about a particular picture. It's actually this picture here, and in it a person just tells a story for it. And you can see that the number of words for each of these are stunningly different, 74,000 down to 300 words per story. And what we're going to do is break every story into 5 equal parts. Okay, so our first one, what are the narrative arcs of traditional stories? Now the first is staging. Now I should tell you that what we do is we essentially go into every kind of story, we standardize it so that it's standardized within person. So the average of this will be 0. So the blue line are our 2,500 novels, and our green line are the 14,000 TATs. What's so striking about this is obviously the lines look really similar for really completely different types of stories, and also in terms of length, etc. Meaning at the beginning of the story, they're using articles and prepositions at high rates, and they drop over the course of the story. Okay, the second one are the auxiliary verbs, pronouns, etc. And again, you see shockingly similar patterns showing this somewhat curvilinear increase over time. And again, the three types of corpora are remarkably similar. That is, at the beginning of the story, even in a really, really, really long novel, they're still setting the stage. There's not much plot going on in the first, 20,000 words of War and Peace, probably 50,000 words of War and Peace. You're still slogging through. But then the action starts by the second segment, and it's off to the races. And then the last one are the cognitive tension dimensions. And there you see a general curvilinear effect. The one that I like, of course, is the novel. The novel is the most striking. But it's interesting that all show the same general pattern. Think about what all this is. We are getting at almost the guts, the DNA of what stories are, looking not at all about what the content is, just the raw structure of them. Okay, this raises a second question. Are good stories different from bad stories? Now, this is a tough one because romance novels and movie dialogue are what we use. So the movie dialogue is from the IMDb database and the ratings that people have made. The romance novels are, this is a place where both professional but also amateurs write romance novels, and there are people rate them. And the rating, there's not a hell lot of ratings, so the ratings are less trustworthy. And for all of them, we split them in terms of good, average, and below average. And the ratings are skewed. Now, it is important to appreciate even a lousy movie to be in the IMDb database should be reasonably good, but we've all seen some of those that aren't. Okay, so let's start at the top. Romance novels. The blue lines are the low-rated ones, and the gray one are the high-rated. There's no damn difference. But it's also interesting, this is a replication of what we found with the previous. Same general pattern with plot progression and cognitive tension. Same thing also for movies, that the patterns are reasonably similar. So we're not able to discriminate good ones from bad ones. Now maybe if they were really, really, really bad ones that were never made or didn't make the IMDb database or were so horrible for a romance novel that nobody would even agree it was a romance novel, maybe it would. But what this is suggesting is even good versus bad are still showing the same general patterns of what culture believes is a story, a kind of a traditional story. So this goes into another world. What if we start looking at different types of narratives? Now, these aren't stories. So we have New York Times articles, and we have a zillion of those, a bunch of Supreme Court opinions, and also TED Talks. Okay, so we're now changing our graph so I can throw them all together. So you've already seen this, but now I've just imposed the different graphs on top of each other. And this is just for novels. So we see, as we've seen before, the staging drops, the plot progression goes up, and the narrative arc, the cognitive tension, shows the curvilinear pattern. Now let me show you what this looks like with our other dimensions. So here, this is the one you just saw. You've now seen it several times. Let's go to the New York Times articles. Okay, we get the same thing in terms of staging. You see a similar kind of thing in terms of what we're calling plot progression. It's not really plot progression now because it's not a plot, but it kind of is. But the thing that's really different are the cognitive tension words. That the cognitive tension in a New York Times article is at the end, not in the middle. And think about what a newspaper article is. Such and such happened yesterday, this happened, this happened, this happened, and at the end, I wonder what it all means. It could be this. What are the implications? More needs to be known, but So it's not like a traditional story. It's a different kind of narrative. This is almost a picture of a different type of genre. Supreme Court decisions. This one's bizarre. Here is the staging. And I should tell you, Supreme Court decisions, by and large, are not, they're not exciting things to read. And what's interesting is who the audience is. So in a traditional story, the author is assuming that the audience knows nothing about the Three Pigs or Cinderella. They have to start from the very beginning. Whereas in a Supreme Court decision, the judge or judges are writing for an audience that they presume already know the basic facts, they already know the rules of law, etc. And so there's very little need to have the staging that we typically think. And again, the plot progression is the same as the others, but the cognitive tension is also at the end. Okay, we've made all these decisions, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. I wonder what it means for the future of mankind, etc. And finally, the last one are TED Talks. TED Talks are somewhat similar in that, to some of the others, in that you still have the staging, you have the increase in plot, and we're finding that same thing in terms of the cognitive tension, and you start listening to these TED Talks, and it's true, at the end, that's when they're asking questions. I wonder what it all means, what are the implications for the future, etc. What's interesting to me about this is it's almost as though we're getting the structure of different types of narratives, that all narratives are different. And we've actually done many other things, you know, the switchboard corpus for telephone conversations, or we've done many, many other things, and each one shows a different picture. And I should say, these aren't necessarily strong effects. I mean, the statistical power is modest, but the degree to which we see these differences is really quite striking. So that is the work that we've been doing on the narrative structure. Yeah.
So, in the last graph, it kind of strikes me that part of it could be about narrative structure, but also part of it could be about the intent of the author.
That's right.
And in the New York Times, the intent is often come back and keep reading our paper. If we answered all your questions, you wouldn't come back.
That's right. And it's also the nature of news. And this is what's so interesting is news is by definition new. And so we all know that there will be more soon.
So have you thought about in the novels actually separating out series and final books versus initial books in a series?
That's a great question. No, we haven't. And I'm sure we have some that were actually published as serials. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, just another question about this slide particularly. Just wondering how internally consistent each of these categories were. I'm wondering, like, for example, is the Supreme Court more consistent because it's kind of formulaic in the way that it's written?
You know, it's funny. I would have said that the New York Times article were the most formulaic. And we actually broke them down into science articles versus other New York Times articles, and they're all the same. And yes, I would guess that they are formulaic. And so that, just like newspaper articles are formulaic in that the first paragraph is supposed to have all the basic information you need. But yes, I think you're right that this does reflect kind of a formulaic writing strategy.
Just error bars, you know, just to understand how much work.
Oh, you ask for so much. Can you say anything about the error bars?
They're big.
They're big. Okay. Yeah,
There's a lot of variation.
But are they different between the different groups?
Oh yeah. And the effect size, the effect sizes for all of this. So we can look at effect sizes in a lot of ways. We can look at it, you know, just for the line itself. We can also look at it in comparison with the others. The effect sizes are in terms of variance accounted for is anywhere from, you know, 1% to sometimes as high as 20%. In terms of the differences, anything you look at that looks like a difference, it is a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was wondering how many of these kind of nuances and artifacts come from the language itself and how much from the personality of the person? Like, I can imagine in many Latin languages, also my native language, you can get away without using pronouns most of the time. Like, even if you want
That's
to say
right,
your
that's
name,
right.
like I am
Exactly,
Sarah, like,
exactly.
you don't, and often using I or we is bad style.
That's right, that's right. That's a great question. We have not analyzed them in the native language. We have analyzed them when they've been translated into English in the past. And those patterns, I suspect, I'm trying to remember, I did some of those earlier on, and I found that they were similar looking at Japanese. But it was a small sample, similar to what we're finding here for novels. And it's interesting because it's not as though, let's say in Spanish, you're not using I, it's just not the separate word.
You're not using the pronoun per se explicitly.
We are in English. With Spanish, we've played with it both ways. By the way, there are individual differences, and with Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court was basically just over the last, I forget how many years, I was able to get it down to look at, it was about 18 different Supreme Court justices and do analyses on each one of them. And there were almost always, they were beautiful lines. In other words, it wasn't random. There's one exception, Souter was the exception. But all the others, but there were variations in terms of how people wrote. Yes?
Yeah, from the beginning of this talk, I was trying to get my mind around your use of articles and prepositions as a criteria for your categorization, and right away, I started thinking about different languages. Spanish, Romance languages, for
Yes.
example, will have many more articles than
That's right.
English. Other languages like Chinese have
That's
no
right.
articles.
That's
so
right.
your use of these categories is English specific.
That's exactly.
Absolutely.
But here's what's interesting. Every language knows the difference between the table and a table. It's referred to differently. But you're exactly right. It's not inherent to the language, and this is a totally ethnocentric approach to text analysis. What?
Well, I agree that you will be able to tell personality from all languages, but by saying that the article
That's right.
is a defining feature is not going to be the case. And
That's
preposition is not going
Well,
to be the case.
so you have to get back to notions of attention and there's an abstraction you have to think of really well.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
right. And we've come up with a wonderful cheat for this when we're doing analyses of other languages. So initially, for the last several years, we have probably 15 different versions of Luke for different languages. And to make a dictionary in other languages is the biggest pain. A linguist will know what a horrible pain it is. So what we've started doing is telling people who want to translate into their language, don't waste your time. You're going to spend a year of your life doing it. Just use Google Translate and do Google Translate and do English Luke with it. Because what we find is Google Translate, anybody who's spent a lot of time with it knows it makes lots of errors, especially with nouns, regular verbs, adjectives, etc. It does a fine job with function words. And Luke is mostly function words. And the things that we generally find in English, we find with the translated into Google's Translate. And we've looked at human, exact translations we'll call them exact translation if there were such a thing, Google Translate, and we compare it with, our native Spanish dictionary or German dictionary or whatever. And what we find is the Google Translate strategy works just fine. And again, to get into this world, and again, to linguists, I know I'm just a problem child. I know. It's because I'm painting with a very broad stroke, and it's good enough. And that's my goal, is to be good enough.
But just other than by my thought, I've been trying to translate in my mind, your use of these terms. Now, in my mind, your staging is simply about things, nouns, and relations. The relations of these two nouns, which in English we use a preposition for.
That's right.
Okay? In other languages, you don't have to use a preposition.
That's right.
So basically, you're saying in the staging, you have to introduce your characters.
That's exactly
and
right.
introduce how they relate, which is, and you're not. That's why
That's
your
right.
auxiliaries are low. So I understand. What I'm just
Exactly.
saying is that you're centering on these given things, article, preposition, but that's not really the point in my mind.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's a little bit more than just nouns,
Yeah,
but
yeah, sure,
which makes it even more complicated. But
yeah.
you're right. This is a cheat sheet to understanding the structure of story.
Yeah, for English, yeah.
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 Yes.
In that connection, you might want to consider what the translation engine is inferring from these languages, just from in languages like Chinese and Japanese, where it infers the articles, what the system has learned
That's right.
in order to predict,
That's right.
in order to create a mapping that actually
That's right.
conforms with your predictions.
That's a very good point.
In other words, it's implicitly learned many of the distinctions sufficiently well that it can.
That's right. And
the results seem to be accurate.
And it's very much the same as a human translator as well. What is the human translator doing to know that it's the table as opposed to a table?
Right. In other words, the human translator has to know
About the
that
context.
there is a context of a table in a room to say it is the table.
That's right.
And we infer these relationships. So in the end, we're getting back to the nouns.
Exactly.
As Leila suggests.
Yeah.
I have a question about the uptick in staging in the novels. There is a small uptick. It's much clearer in the earlier, further on.
Oh, so
Oh yes, that one I think.
okay.
There's this little uptick.
This little thing here,
Yeah, is that significant?
I haven't looked.
Or is it setting up a change in the storyline for the denouement?
That's a great question.
Sort of
You think that would be
What's
significant?
the climax of the story?
Yeah.
Because you often
Yeah,
have
you're
a
setting up the climax
Yeah.
with it by reintroducing
Yeah.
new material.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Ryan agrees with me. I would doubt it's significant, but if it is, it's not a huge effect.
So you mentioned the suicidal stance of poets earlier. Poetry is awfully short, but I wonder, like, have you looked at what the arc looks like in poetry and how very, like, I can't think of very many cognitive tensions in much poetry,
Yeah.
other than maybe the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock or something.
Yeah. You know, it's very interesting. I ended up getting into a long discussion with a poet several years ago in terms of why do poets commit suicide at incredibly higher rates than novelists. And what we came up with is that poetry often encapsulates a moment, a feeling, a powerful experience. Whereas a novel or even a short story or prose, what it does is it forces the author to put that experience into a much larger context. And it's almost as though my intuition, and it sounds like yours is as well, is that you wouldn't find much of a narrative arc with poetry the way you would with longer prose. But that's an empirical question. It's a very interesting question. Okay.
You go first, I'll go.
You go first, exactly.
Okay. Any specific differences between spoken text versus written, like
So,
people speaking?
getting away from this, from other research, we find very similar patterns with spoken and written. And of course, everything is contextual. See? I say this for our linguists. It's really true. Everything is indeed contextual. When we are talking with our friends, we use much, much higher rates of pronouns and low articles. And when we're in a formal situation, it's just the opposite. And writing tends to be more formal than does speaking, but it all depends. But it's very interesting. A person who uses high pronouns in talking compared to other people also tends to use high rates of pronouns when they're writing a test or when they are writing a formal paper. In other words, a high pronoun person tends to be interested in people more than a low pronoun person. This is minus first person singular. Yes?
I'm assuming since you can, based on the research, you can tell sort of personality differences. What about to the extremes, like severe personality or behavioral disorders. How easy and reliable are they to detect from the linguistic text?
Well, this is a really interesting question. We've been doing this with, we've been doing it a little bit with Alzheimer's, and some other people have done that as well. So that is something that's identifiable, but that's not, if you're looking for somebody who is narcissist, well, here's an interesting problem. Narcissism is measured by a personality questionnaire. And I was part of a large project that was involved in like 14 different labs or something ridiculous, where we each contributed large amounts of data. And we find that narcissism is not related to pronouns at all. You think that people who use I are more narcissistic. That might be true, but in terms of self-reports, there's nothing there. The one thing we do find is that narcissists tend to be more certain of what they're talking about. And I should say, Trump's is a fabulous guide for a language person to study, and he uses I at very high rates. And anybody would agree he's a narcissist. So everybody is thinks, well, he uses I, that's just proof that we're right. And it could be when he fills out a questionnaire, he would not say he's a narcissist, just to prove how narcissistic he really is. Yeah.
Please, nice. So have you analyzed Twitter?
Oh yeah, we do.
Okay.
And a lot of other people have done a lot more Twitter than we have.
What do all caps mean?
It probably means something. Yeah.
When you do the Supreme Court analysis, do you find a measurable difference in the justices based on the party of the president that appointed them?
The way that we've done these analyses, I haven't done that. There have been some really interesting analyses historically. So there was a fabulous project that was published years ago looking at Republican versus Democratic appointed justices. And what they found was their arguments were very different. And I forget what the nature of it was. And the article was published, and then within a few years, the shift of the majority, there was a majority shift. And what happened was the minority group were more extreme, and the majority group was more reasoned in their opinions. And this was done when the liberals ran it, and this was presented at a social psychology conference. All good liberals, pointed to the fact that liberals are much more broad and so forth, and that conservatives are all extreme nuts. And then it switched over to the Republicans being in control. And now it's just the opposite. So the majority group's decisions are more reasoned, and the minority groups are more extreme. But I haven't done it in terms of Luke. All right. Ryan and I are going to be in town. We leave Friday. But if you'd like to meet with us, we'd love to talk with you.
So that's the end of your narrative on Friday.
That's the end of the narrative. Exactly. I'll be walking around, no nouns.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.